We're here to talk about discovering Black culture in Paris, Black culture and history, because it's a journey through history and heritage. Everyone wants to go to Paris. So I'm Priscilla with Priscilla Travel, helping you live the dream through travel. And what I do is I provide premium travel planning services and advisory services for empty nesters in the second act of their life. So it's time to up level your vacation. And that's just something that the pandemic has made me realize, stop waiting on everyone else and just do it, because you just don't know how much time you actually have. And then you want to do it while you're still able to get around. Why Paris? Well, Paris is home to, a really significant Black community. And it spans centuries. Africans were brought to Paris, the city, as early as the 17th century. And we know that's because of the slave trade, right? So France was the second largest colonizing nation or European nation behind Britain. Britain was the largest. So they were all competing with each other. So during the slave trade, that's when Africans first were brought to Paris, early as the 17th century, the 1600s, right? Now, slavery in the French kingdom was abolished 2 times. Now, that's weird, isn't it? So the African presence, like I was saying, in France, the Kingdom of France, that's when they had the kings and queens, they abolished slavery twice. Once in 1794 and the second time in 1848. Now I'm talking about the kingdom. That's when they had the kings and the queens. And so they did that the first time because there were some slave uprisings in the colonies in the Caribbean. So they abolished it, and then another king came and reinstated it. And so they abolished slavery in 1848 in France itself, France proper, but it still went on in the colonies. So we know that was all about economics. So many of the European countries abolished slavery in Europe, but they didn't do so in the colonies. Now remember, the United States was a colony. The United States before it was the United States, it was a collection of colonies. Remember the 13 original colonies from school? And some of our states, Louisiana was French. We bought that from the French. I believe that was during Napoleon's time. Yep, the Louisiana Purchase. Florida was originally a Spanish colony. The 13 original colonies on the East Coast were some were Dutch, and then the English took over. The British had colonies in Canada before it was Canada. So all of these, the United States, the Caribbean, were all colonies. Okay, so the United States colonists, they rebelled against England, and that's when the United States was established as a sovereign nation. Now, the war went on for several years. It didn't just end overnight. So another period of time when Africans migrated to Paris were in modern times, right? So African people moved to Paris during modern times from their countries because of economic reasons. Now we know that colonization continued on after slavery, and then in the mid-19th century, the 1900s, 1950s, I believe Ghana was the first African nation to gain its independence, 1957 or 1958. Then the others started to follow like dominoes. But during that time, the countries struggled to get their feet under them economically. So many people went to the colonies. They went to the French colonies. People from the French colonies went to France because at that time, then France let them come there to work. And so many people migrated there for economic reasons, right? So why else do people migrate anywhere? For economic or reasons or war or some benefit. So that's why they went. There were also some Afro-Caribbean people who migrated to France. So we had some French-speaking colonies like Guadeloupe, Haiti, which was Saint-Domingue before. Now, Saint-Domingue was the first nation in the Caribbean to gain its independence, the first Black colony to gain its independence from France. So, and that was in the 1700s. So there were other French-speaking Caribbean countries. Guadeloupe is one. Let's see, St. Martin, there's a French side and there is an English side. Haiti, and then there are a few others, right? So we also have an African Caribbean presence in Paris now. So Paris is pretty multicultural if you were to visit there. You would not recognize it. It's nothing like you would imagine on TV, you know, all the things that we would see on TV. France itself in general, it's pretty multicultural. So it became the cultural hub for Black people coming from the Caribbean, because they've been residing there since the 18th century. And then I'm going to be talking about a couple people who actually became quite famous in France, in Paris specifically. So here's Saint Georges Chevalier. He lived from 1745 to 1799. They made a movie about him. He was called the Black Mozart. So he was the son of a French nobleman and an enslaved Senegalese woman. So Senegal was one of the colonies on the coast of Africa. Of course, they had territories. It wasn't the countries the way they're split up right now. So there was actually a movie called Chevalier that came out. And if you're interested, I can put the links to that movie, Chevalier. It's on Prime Video, and you can watch it. He was a composer, and he actually, he was a very talented person. So he was a composer, a violinist, and a conductor of the opera. And he was a swordsman. Now, his father brought him to Paris from Guadeloupe, and sent him to school. And if you do decide to check out that movie, then I think it's a pretty good movie. You know, of course they dramatized it a lot. They put a lot of drama in it and stuff, you know, but he actually was in charge of the opera when Marie Antoinette was queen. So he actually trained her. He wrote many, many compositions. Of course, when the French Revolution happened, many of the records were burned. And for other reasons, his works were also hidden. It's only now recently that people are starting to find and discover some of his works that he wrote. He was a composer. So when I was in school growing up, my mom had us take piano lessons. So we used to play classical music. So he was actually he was a few years older than Mozart. Ludwig van Mozart. They called him the Black Mozart, but he was actually a few years older than Mozart, and Mozart actually went to meet him. So they had sort of a rivalry there, him and Mozart. He was the first Black professional orchestra leader in France. And he was also a colonel in the French Legion during the French Revolution. So he was the leader of the first all-Black regiment in Europe. So this was between the time of the fall of the French Empire and the French Kingdom and during the French Revolution. Now, a lot of things happened during that time. But this guy, I mean, he was really talented. He was also a ladies' man. He never married, but he was quite an accomplished composer, and he was quite competitive. Now here is General Thomas Alexandre Dumas. Now he was born in 1762 and died in 1806. Now he was born on the island of Saint-Domingue, right? Dominique or Saint-Domingue, which is modern day Haiti. Now, he was also the son of a nobleman, and an enslaved woman. So he was sent to Paris as well. actually became quite a swordsman himself. He was a very famous general, and you would never realize that this famous general was a Black person, a Black man. And during the French Revolutionary War, he was one of the most respected commanders of the French army during the Revolution. And he actually knew Napoleon Bonaparte. And of course, Napoleon, after they deposed the king and queen, and Napoleon became the ruler, of course, Mr. or General Thomas Alexandre Dumas was disposable, but he was quite the swordsman too. He and Mr. Chevalier, Joseph Bologna, the Chevalier, they actually served in the same unit. But this guy was one of the most respected commanders of the French army. And guess who he fathered? Alexandre Dumas, the writer, one of the greatest French writers of all times. He wrote The Count of Monte Cristo. How many of you remember that from school? And how many times have you seen The Three Musketeers? I've seen The Three Musketeers since I was a kid, and it's been made over so many times. But who would have known that it was a Black guy? He's of mixed race ancestry, but look at his hair. He's a Black man. He wrote The Count of Monte Cristo, if you remember the story at all. He wrote the story of The Count of Monte Cristo about his father, the general, because the father was thrown in prison by Napoleon at one time. And that story was inspired by the experiences of his father, General Alexandre Dumas. He also wrote, like I said, The Three Musketeers, and he also helped break down racial barriers in French society. So after they deposed the king and queen, remember, Aunt Marie Antoinette said, let them eat cake, and they beheaded her. So, and then they took over. Now it's been a republic ever since. Now, here's some other famous people. Angelique Kidjo. I would love to be able to see her in concert one day. This lady here is a really, really talented artist. She is from Benin. She's a Beninese French artist, singer, songwriter, actress, and activist, born in 1960. She studied at the CIM, a jazz school in Paris, because of things that were going on in her country at the time. She, in the 80s, went to live in Paris and then went to school. And she was supposed to be an attorney, but she actually studied music. And she is really one of the most talented singers because of her fusion of music, different styles, jazz, and some of her native styles. She is quite famous, and she's known all over the world. Angelique Kidjo. So she actually was the recipient of the Polar Music Prize in 2023. That's considered to be the most prestigious music prize in the entire world. So that's Angelique Kidjo. So she's just another example of Black people living in France and contributing to the culture and the society. Now, here we go to the African American Chronicles. Now, some of you may know, but others of you may not be familiar about some of our history as an American in France, an African American in France. So there's some unique history there regarding us. So James Hemings, he was born in 1765, died in 1801. He didn't live very long. He was a formerly enslaved chef. He was an American chef. Can you guess who he was related to? James Hemings. Hemings is the hint. Thomas Jefferson is the other hint. So James Hemings was Sally Hemings' brother. He was he was owned by Thomas Jefferson. Now, this is before the Revolution. Well, during the Revolution, before the United States became the United States. Okay, so Thomas Jefferson, as well as James Madison, John Jay, and some of those other founding father dudes that we learned about back in elementary school. They went to France. They were ambassadors, or they had posts in France because they wanted to be recognized as independent nations. Now, Thomas Jefferson at the time was the ambassador, the American minister to France in the 1780s. Now, what he did was he took Sally Hemings with him. Remember the story about Sally? And the thing of it is when they went there with him, they were free because France had already abolished slavery during that time. The time that they were there, Sally was free, and so was James. So James was actually a chef. He was already a cook on the plantation, but when he went there, he made a deal with Thomas Jefferson because Thomas Jefferson wanted to have clout. And this man was so talented at his skill, he went to school. He sent him to culinary school. So he went to formal culinary school in France, right? And this guy actually worked for some of the royalty in France, and he studied with a famous caterer in France, right? I can't remember his name. Now, he went to formal culinary training, and guess what he introduced to U.S. cuisine? So he actually negotiated the terms of his freedom because he said, if I do this, when I come back to the United States, I want to be free. I'll come back. Because he could have just stayed, you know. They didn't make him go back. He could have just stayed, and Sally could have too. They could have just stayed in France, and they would have been free. So something similar happened during the Haitian Revolution, when the Haitian people, they rebelled against France, and then all of the French nobility, they left and came to the United States. This was like in the 1790s, I believe. So they went to Pennsylvania. Now, Pennsylvania was a free state. So when they got there, they brought some of their slaves. Now, the slaves didn't want to go on their own. They made them go, right? They grabbed some and took them. And when they got there, they were not happy to find out that these slaves were free. And I know that this story is close to my heart because my dad was from Philadelphia, and he used to tell us about the abolitionists and the society, the abolition society. And he used to tell us about that we believe that our ancestors, our great-great-grandfather, came from Haiti during the Revolution. So there were some families who came, and some changed their names from French last names to English names because they were afraid that they would be made to, because it was litigation and everything. Of course, they didn't win, the former plantation owners. So some of them started going to Louisiana because they wanted to preserve slavery. But yeah, so this fella here, he invented macaroni and cheese. That's one of our American staples. He brought it back, introduced it to United States cuisine. Creme brulee as well. That's one of my favorites. I love creme brulee. So also they suspect French fries. French fries. Get it? French fries. Yeah. So if you go to France, some of the food, you'll find some of the same foods that we eat here in the restaurants, hamburgers, French fries, things like that. Of course, they have their other frou-frou food that's a bit different. But yeah, he introduced macaroni and cheese to the United States cuisine. So he came back, became free, and then it was pretty sad what happened with him because once he came back to the U.S., of course, slavery was still going on here in the U.S., and then there was extreme, supremacy and racism here in the United States. So he did not have the same celebrity status or the same level of reputation, and he was a big guy when he was in France. So when he came back, he wasn't. He died from alcoholism. He was an alcoholic and he got sick. So, and he died early. That was James Hemings. Now, here we go to some more African Americans. Now, these African Americans, some of you may not know about them. This is James Europe and the 369th Harlem Hellfighter Band from World War I. Now, how many of you knew that U.S. black soldiers fought in World War I for France? How many of you know that? They helped liberate France during the First World War from the Germans. So this band, actually, you see they're playing their jazz instruments. They're the ones who introduced jazz to France. This guy, James Europe, he was a famous band leader in the United States in Harlem. And he joined the military, this 369th Regiment. These folks wanted to distinguish themselves, and they joined. They figured we would be considered equal if we served our country. Now, there are black people who've been in every single war in the United States. Every single war, there have been African American people in those wars. So that's important that people know that. Even the Revolutionary War, they fought then too. So these folks went to World War I. They were mainly supply. They did supplies. They worked in the back, but the French needed help. So the U.S. government loaned these black soldiers to France. And then when they did, they distinguished themselves so much. The very first black combat pilot was Eugene Bullock. He could only fight for France during World War I because the military was segregated. So black people weren't allowed to have guns. And the French were like, that doesn't make sense. Why would you do that to your citizens? You know what I mean? So, but the French used these soldiers and they distinguished themselves. And they were very fierce warriors. That's why they called them the Harlem Hellfighters. And this band, the Harlem Hellfighter Band, brought jazz to France. So jazz is pretty big in France because of this. Now, they brought black culture to France. So during World War I, many African Americans after the war decided to go back, because when they came back home after the war, there were a lot of uprisings against black people. Okay, so there were these race riots. So there was one in New York, because this group was from New York. There was a big one in New York. So many of these people, they didn't experience the same level of respect. And some of them went back to France. So we have a lot of musicians who went back to France after World War I. So here goes some of the artists. We've got Sidney Bechet. He was from Louisiana. He was a famous clarinetist, and he was a jazz player. And he went from France to Britain, back to the U.S., and then in his elder years, he went back to France. But he was one of the very first. We have Louis Satchmo Armstrong. He was also a famous jazz music blues player. And we have Ada Bricktop Smith. These are just some examples of some black entertainers who moved to France, moved to Paris, actually, because they had the freedom to pursue their craft. They could escape extreme racism. So that's why they went. Then we have the most famous of all, Miss Josephine Baker. Miss Josephine Baker went to France during, I think, the 1920s. So she was a Black entertainer. She lived through the race wars of St. Louis, I believe. She lived through that. So she went to Paris and became an overnight success. She was a trailblazing entertainer. She also served as a double agent for the French resistance during World War II. Now, how many people knew that? Did anybody know that Josephine Baker was actually a resistance fighter during World War II for the French? She was a spy. She actually used to smuggle messages between the French, who were occupied by the Germans again. They used to smuggle messages to the Allied forces, Canada, United States forces, British forces, because she was a performer. They didn't think anything of her. You know, they didn't think she would actually was smart enough to do anything like that. But she actually became a citizen of France. She gave up her United States citizenship and she just never came back. She hid Jews also during the Holocaust in her chateau. She did. She hid some Jewish people at her chateau. So this lady, she was really, really brave. Could you imagine what could have happened to her had she been found out? She would have messages written in invisible ink of all things. Who would have thought that there was invisible ink invented back then? Invisible ink was written in her gowns and in her sheet music between the lines, and she would pass messages between the French resistance and the Allied forces. So that's Miss Josephine Baker. She died in 1975. She was also a civil rights activist. She refused to sing at segregated audiences in the United States. She just refused to do it. She would not do it. She was like, nope. If these audiences segregated, I'm just not going to do it. She refused to perform. She was famous in Europe, famous in France. And she was a celebrity and she was a civil rights activist. In 2021, she was symbolically interred at the French Pantheon. That's the Hall of Heroes in Paris. So they didn't, as she was actually buried in Monaco on her friend, the Princess of Monaco. I believe that was Grace Kelly, as a matter of fact. At her friend's estate, her family didn't want to move her bones, but they symbolically interred her. She was recognized as a hero. She was a French hero. She was the first Black person to be recognized as a hero. And that's where all the heroes were buried. Now, we also can talk about the Harlem Renaissance, which also occurred during the 1920s and spanned to the 1930s. So we've got many African-American artists, such as writers, musicians. I talked a little bit about that already. Many performers, they sought artistic freedom and they wanted to escape racism and segregation. So James Baldwin is just one person. Langston Hughes spent some time there. There are many of them who went to Paris to pursue their craft. There were artists who went there because they would not be successful during those times in the United States. Galleries wouldn't show their work. They were not given the opportunity. So they went to France. They went to Paris. Josephine Baker became a Black Parisian. We've had other Parisians from Africa, from the Caribbean, from the U.S. I believe Sidney Bechet actually moved back there before he died to Paris and had a family in his old age. Who would think? So there are many significant contributions to Paris's culture, society, and its political movements. It's also culturally diverse, and it's helped shape the country's global and cultural face. So it's up to us to pass this knowledge on to our offspring, make sure that they learn it. My parents taught me. We have been in every single war the United States of America has had from colonial times. We have been with Lewis and Clark. The guides, one of the guides was a black guy for Lewis and Clark when they wanted to go from coast to coast and expand the United States. A black guide was with the first explorer who went to the North Pole. But we don't hear these stories. But I mean, it's up to us to learn, and then we pass this information along to our kids because they need to know. So my parents had to do it for us, my sister and I, when we were growing up, because in the 60s and 70s, that was unheard of, you know? But now the opportunity is there, but it's being taken out of the school. So we have to go back to what we did before. So this is Priscilla with Scylla Travel, hoping that you have a great rest of your day, morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever it is that you watch this video, and from wherever you watch it, if you share it with your friends and family. Thanks for watching. And remember, as always, live the dream. Bye-bye.